This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Emma Darwin and I are going to talk about the old adage, show, don't tell, and what that really means. Now, Emma's the author of The Mathematics of Love, A Secret Alchemy, and her blog, The Sitch of Writing, as well as the craft book, Get Started in Writing Historical Fiction. She has been nominated for both the Commonwealth Writers' Best First Book and an RNA Romantic Novel of the Year award for the first book, or for the same book, by the way. That pretty darn impressive. And she mentors and tutors writers and has a PhD in creative writing. So welcome back, Emma. This is actually our third episode we're doing, so hopefully our listeners are like, yeah, we know Emma. We're ready. Let's get into this.
Thank you, Alida. It's good to be back.
Thank you. Well, okay, so show, don't tell. Often heard, often misunderstood. Let's get into some nitty-gritty here. What does it mean, show, don't tell? I'll let you start us off.
Well, the don't bit is just plain rubbish.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
If this was a broadcast, it is rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. And I do think it's responsible for, A, some really bad writing.
Yes.
And B, for some very, very miserable aspiring writers.
Yes.
Stare at it and say, can I say I loved her? Is that showing or telling? They say miserably and all that sort of stuff. And so I want to basically take the don't out and, chuck it out the window. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I think it's extremely useful to think about the different ways that you might write something in terms of labeling some ways as showing and some ways as telling, because they are very different.
Yes.
One of the things I often do, it's too late to change the terminology, but I often spend a lot of time, I talk about showing as evoking.
Yes.
And I talk about telling as informing.
Mm-hmm.
Or I talk about showing as presenting, as in just laying something out and letting the reader to understand it however they will. And so if showing is presenting, then telling might be explaining. Showing might be detailing, and telling might be summarizing.
Right.
So showing and telling, they're very useful. I mean, they are genuinely really useful labels, despite having said I want to get rid of the don't. but actually they are quite complex. What we're labeling
incredibly
is quite complicated things, which I think is probably why people get in a muddle with it. But on the whole, my default is to think of showing as evoking and telling as informing.
Yeah, I really like that distinction. We do need both, and I think the oversimplification of that adage is what confuses writers, because they're taking it at face value, and you really need to unpack a lot of material there. And the work of narrative exposition is what we're doing when we're telling in the right way, in the good, effective way. And exposition means to expose. So you are revealing things to your reader using your narrator, your narrative voice, your authorial voice, or character in a different time and place if it's a first-person narrative. And you can't tell a story without that. Your narrative is your storyteller.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can't actually not use a teller, a narrator of some sort. How sort of strongly characterized they are, separate from the point of view of any particular character, of course, is up to you.
Right.
You don't all have to be kind of Dickens, having opinions or having opinions. But equally, there's nothing to stop you, the tone of the narration being different from the tone of the when you're inside a character, a viewpoint character's head, and and the world is being written, with the tone that suits that character. It is one reason, and we'll probably come back. I'll just mention it now because we'll probably come back to it. It's one reason I find thinking in terms of what John Gardner calls psychic distance really, really helpful. Other people call it narrative distance. It's much the same, but it is this question of, how deep inside the viewpoint character are you? Because it's not only just an either or. It's actually a matter of degree. Or are you right outside, in which case, if you're not in any viewpoint character, what is the consciousness, if you like, that's forming the way it's being narrated?
Right.
I think telling it's very useful for exposition. It's useful for covering the ground. It's useful for just getting over the dull stuff. You know,
oh
just
my
if
God.
you say, or just, you know, if you've got a really, really key scene where, you know, somebody's ex is coming back to collect the record collection, or the dog, and it's really crucial, and we both know that the two parties to this scene have got very important things they need, which are clashing, so there's going to be conflict. But there still may be bits of that scene you don't need to write out, as say a playwright would have to write them out, or a movie script. There might just be a moment for saying, when they had sorted out the coffee.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, narrative summary.
When he boiled the kettle and put the dog out. You know.
Right.
Doesn't have to be real time.
Right. A narrative summary is the writer's best friend, because, you know, a common error with younger writers is, okay, I need my character to fly from Atlanta to New York, so my character has to take a taxi to the airport and go through security and get on the airplane and ride next to the boring old lady with the knitting needles and then get to... No.
I think, well, to be fair, I think often as writers our imagination needs to do that.
Yes.
You know, as a writer, you may need to make your imagination walk through all that. You just don't need it in the second draft.
Exactly. The reader does not need to know that. So unless something else is happening on that airplane or through that security checkpoint that advances your story, has that narrative momentum we were talking about in the other episode, which we'll link to. You can cut it, use some simple summary, you know, use a scene break and say, he arrived in New York.
You can just do a scene break and do a double line space. I think a skill I don't see as much of in in students and as I think would be useful for them is not doing the scene break. A movie has to do a scene break. A movie doesn't have any other way of doing that. Though I noticed with digital coming along, they're finding more ways of, you know, sort of montages and stuff like that. You know, where the old movies had the pages flying off the calendar, you know, that sort of stuff. But we can, because, you know, we can cover 10 years in a sentence, or one day and 659 pages in my copy of James Joyce's Ulysses, which is one day. But I think, I think, you know, ways of moving, and I've got blog posts on the itch of writing of all of these, actually. I've got a whole thing about moving from scene to scene, and the different choices you've got, and how you might do various ways. But I also think it's almost a trick, which is what I call making your telling showy, which is how to do those quick ground covering handful of sentences about the flight from New York to Atlanta, in a way that doesn't just say she took a flight from New York to Atlanta, it was long and boring, and then she got off. Which evoke, you know, because showing is all I've talked about evoking. You know, it's about the senses. A phrase I'm constantly using is vivid and particular. It's almost always about individual things. You know, because the brain, the human brain finds imagining much easier if something is specific. If I say tree, it's not as vivid as if I say oak. Oak brings with it all sorts. Partly, you know, if you know a bit about trees, it might bring the actual shape, but it also brings acorns, it brings hearts of oak, it brings lots of implications, it brings something physical
associations
that tree doesn't. And so one of the, you know, they kissed under the rotting oak, they fought under the weeping willow, both of which are more vivid than they met under the tree.
Precisely. So part of showing is specificity and evoking associations in your reader through that specificity. And showing...
And telling is... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say showing for me is so much about in-scene writing. So you've got your narrative exposition where we're really with the storyteller exposing things to the reader, and then you've got your in-scene writing where we're really with the characters who are on the stage of the page, essentially performing. This is where we have the dialogue and the action, the doing and the being, as opposed to the more structural, reflective, mood setting, the ambient, etc. work of the narrative.
Having said that, I think this, that's not to say that once you're in a scene you can't step out.
No, it's very fluid.
It's very fluid, and particularly I think this is, as we were talking in an earlier episode, I think this is one of those things where it's, if you work out how this story is going to be told, and it's something that is how present the narrator is. How much do we have a sense of a narrator, a story, and that's when I start talking about them as a storyteller. How much are they in charge?
Yes.
And if they are in charge, I mean, even to the point of explaining stuff about the characters, maybe that the characters maybe don't know. A.S. Byatt talks about how she doesn't like the term omniscient narrator, which I don't either, but she talks about knowledgeable narrators, which I think is useful, or privileged, in the sense that as the writer you grant the narrator's consciousness. It doesn't have to be a character, a person. No. You grant them privileged access to certain heads. I often think it's a bit like a swipe card that lets you in some buildings in your company, but not all of them, and the card's coded up for that. And so, you code your narrator swipe card for access to certain viewpoint characters.
Right.
But also, how aware are you, how much do they have a presence in the narrative? And the more control they have in the narrative, the more we're aware of them telling us.
Yes.
And then letting us into heads and so on.
Right.
And particularly if they are quite in control, then it's perfectly possible. You could have a really in charge narrator who says, "I'm not going to narrate narrate the whole of the dinner because that was really boring. What was exciting was right at the end when somebody picked up their fork and said, 'I would like to announce whatever.'"
Right.
But that's a very present narrator.
Yeah. Yes, and I like what you were saying about the swipe cards giving the narrator access to certain heads, and that's really about your point of view and how many points of view do you have. So it's a single point of view story. The narrator might have certain information that goes beyond the scope of our character's knowledge, but we're only going to enter the perspective of one character and look through the lens of that character's eyes and head, so the narrator and the point of view character are separate. And if you're doing multiple, whether it's 2 or 10, you have to have that continuity we were talking about in the other episode. So you set those rules for yourself. Whose head can my narrator go into? When am I entering these heads? Are there shifts at scene breaks, only at chapter breaks? Is it completely fluid like in an omniscient novel? And those rules you set for yourself are going to shape your narrative in the showing versus telling, and how that exposition functions in relationship to the action.
Yes. And generally speaking, your reader will go with whatever you do, as long as they have learned. If this is a narrator who goes inside lots of different heads, then you don't want to be totally, the reader is likely to get uneasy if it's consistently in one head for 9/10 of the novel, and suddenly we get a whole flurry of different viewpoints. We're not going to be convinced. Chance. Well, there are no rules. There are only ever ways, that work better and ways that work worse.
Right.
Generally speaking, and some it depends on your reader what they'll go with. But on the whole, we've talked about this earlier. The beginning. I read the playwrights say it's about the first 20 minutes of a play. The reader is still, the audience in that case is still completely open to however this world works. Do people fly? Do people take their clothes off? Do people break the fourth wall and talk to the audience? And as writers, we have our equivalents of those. Right. They call it the language of the drama. We have our equivalent. And I won't say language because we get confused. But I think that we have the equivalent. Is this a narrator who can go inside lots of? Is this a narrator who summarizes a lot? Is this a narrator who does cover the ground quickly and say that it was that year that everybody grew up and learnt to be a terrorist? Right. That could really work. We don't necessarily have to have, in August they learnt this, in September they learnt that, in January they were examined about the other. We don't need acres of scenes about learning to strip down rifles and hide them down in your boots, whatever it might be. We might. But the straight out summary, particularly I think if what's in the summary is really potent, and I think this is where making your telling showy, making your exposition, you're covering the ground exposition, in there is enough potent stuff. If you see what I mean?
Yes.
We have a sense of vividness even under it's difficult without examples. I mean, I have got a long post on the Situation Writing about showing and telling, and a lot on psychic distance, because I think in lots of ways it's kind of the keys to the kingdom. It is sorts out so much else, because it integrates showing and telling, viewpoint.
Right. Yes.
There's all sorts of different things that new writers sort of, they just think they're going to hang on showing and telling, and they think, oh, but it's all about point of view.
And they think that if they, they think telling is forbidden, and so everything is like dialogue, action, and then the story is just so flat because there's no setting, there's no world, there's no mood, there's no, no exposition.
And also, it has no, as a narrative, it has no character. It has no flavor.
Yeah, it has no voice.
If you pick up a page of a novel, and goodness knows, plenty get published.
Right.
You wouldn't know who it's by.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because there's no narrative presence.
It's a script. It's a script in waiting, as it were.
Right.
Some big sellers. Michael Crichton's very like that a lot of the time, and that's one of the reasons he makes fabulously successful movies. But it's very dull, and on the whole, movies do it better than prose does. I tend to feel
movies have it so easy because they've got a team of creatives. It's not just a writer doing everything with words. You've got your writer, your director, your cameras, your lighting, your sound effects, your actors bringing people to life, developing accents and mannerisms and body language and such. And so when people avoid telling, it's like taking your movie crew and stripping away, 3/4 of the people who are involved in creating the story. In fact, this is an analogy I use in my point of view book. And I say, I list like all the things you have to do and who's in charge. And you've got on a movie the set designer, the sound designer, the director, the actors, the camera, people. And in story, it's author as narrator, or in a couple places. So I've got 2 author as character, 1 is author as narrator and character, and the rest are character. And there's mood, style, voice, character development, dialogue, costume, setting, properties, lighting, sound effects, and action. So I know people who are just audio can't see the table, but for the video.
And we're doing it all. And of course, and the other thing I think that is the other way that analogies with film are quite revealing, is that we have what no film can do, which is we can go inside heads.
Yes,
we can go inside consciousness, which is brilliant. I mean, it's what we do that film and drama can't, except with the soliloquy or the voiceover, which is kind of in a bit of a mission of failure in some ways.
Exactly.
And I think and also we have, unlike voiceovers and soliloquies, we have a completely seamless shift from inside to outside, which is the key to psychic distance, narrative distance, whatever you want to call it. And so I think one of the things about showing and telling that is not that is important to get your head around is it's worth remembering that there's telling, but even if when you tell, it depends which head you're in, which consciousness the telling is coming through, is how it will be told. And the same with showing. I mean, 3 people walking down a road will see 3 different well, physically they'll see 3 different angles, depending a bit on how close they are. Or 3 people sitting in a room, physically they'll see 3 different angles. Mentally, they will experience that room differently, depending on who they are. And one will mostly notice their lovely old granny who seems to be really poorly, and they hope she's not going to die. Another will be in a rage because the room is plastered with all the photographs of Granny's amazingly successful grandchildren, and he's the one unsuccessful,
the one not there.
Really so he's got none there, and he hates it. And he's really angry.
Right.
And a third who hasn't been there before and is absolutely fascinated is looking around the room because it's completely preserved as it was set up in 1950, and it's never changed. And she's a social historian. So that's not just physical point of view, that's mental point of view,
right?
But also the so they will notice things, the showing, if you like,
right?
the detail of the room.
And I think it's worth.
But also the take of it is one of them will say it was a summarizing, a tell, if you like.
Right.
It was obsessively stuffed with every possible frame.
Right.
Framed thing you could ever think.
Yeah.
Whereas another one will say it breathed the 1950s, or another one will say this was an extremely interesting example of a psychological state which is reluctant to let go of the distant past.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? I mean, even all of those are summarizing.
Yeah, and I want to
detail, but
add to your example that part of this psychic distance or narrative distance, looking through the narrative, looking through the lens of the point of view character, is an emotional distance as well. So the visitor who's never been there before is going to have an emotional distance because this is neutral territory, and it might be fascinating, it might be dull, whatever, but then the one who's angry is going to have a great emotional charge with this environment and this scenario. And then the one who's the favored grandchild, who's worried that grandma's ill, might be looking very sentimentally at the trappings and thinking about the day they're going to be taking them down because Granny's no longer with them. So those are three very different emotional states. And the mood and the voice you use in your narrative and that telling piece of this scene is going to depend very much on which character is emoting, whose point of view and whose perspective we're using on that scene.
Yes, both what you show us through those eyes, and the way they think about it. And of course, there's nothing to stop you having a fourth element in that, which is the narrator.
Yes, precisely.
And it could be, it's completely, it's as we were saying earlier, part of how the book works. Whether that narrator is effectively a fourth point of view.
Right, right. And the narrator can be very neutral, the kind of invisible author behind the curtain, or could be the storyteller with the presence and a personality and opinions. You can go kind of across that spectrum.
Or, I mean, the storyteller, I can even imagine the storyteller being, in a sense, the granny.
Right, yes.
Or imagine the granny now being dead, telling the story. I mean, I'm not doing a Lovely Bones thing, but sort of. I think it can be helped. I mean, I am by nature. I came from writing first person. My first few novels were in first person. I think, as a lot of beginner writers are. I think because instinctively or consciously you realize that it closes down the choices a lot.
Right. It does.
Which makes it manageable. And it's also easier in lots of ways to find the voice again, because there's something stated,
it's the voice of the character. Yeah,
it'll be the voice of the character,
right?
And that's the thing. And so I remember on a forum many years ago realizing that lots of us had just had published our first and second novels, and so there are a whole batch of us. They're still the core of my writerly friends. Thank God for online forums. A whole batch of us were working on our third novel, somewhat with the publisher breathing down our neck, even if it wasn't under contract. There was that consciousness. And blow me down, most of us had, as it happened, written the first couple in first, and all of us were trying a third person with an external narrator.
Right.
I often, again, we all talk about first and third narrator all the time, but I often try to talk, it's a term borrowed from narratology, about internal and external narrators, because I think that's a much more useful distinction. First and third is just the means by which you do it. What really matters is whether your narrator is inside the story or outside it. And as soon as you've got an external narrator, you've got all the choice in the world, and you have to make, there's many more options, which is more alarming, really.
It is, but I find with my coaching clients that first person also has an inherent danger to it, in that people really lose track of their narrator because they're only seeing the character as telling the story, and they forget that you need to have your character who's got some perspective, maybe some hindsight. Besides the psychic and emotional distance, there is the chronological distance. Is the narrator authorial and kind of godlike or omniscient-like, being over and above that external narrator who can just see the world like, like a model train set or something built there? Or is the narrator the character whose knowledge and experience is limited to what that character knows, but it might be 20 years down the road, it might be 3 days down the road, and that's going to affect your knowledge, your perspective, your emotional distance, your hindsight. But that differentiation between character and narrator is what allows you to tell the story.
And it's still I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that you still have a distinction between that, Jane.
Right.
Jane says I, but Jane narrator is in some fundamental way a different. I often talk about different. Jane actor.
Yes.
No, because character covers both, but if you think there's narrator and actor, even act or with a dash to remind people I'm not talking about a thespian, but I'm talking about the person who acts.
Right.
And I think it's one of the very problematic things about first person present tense, because that distance is very difficult to gain.
We're going to wrap up this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable here with Emma and I agreeing wholeheartedly that there's a problem with first-person narrators when the writer doesn't really understand the separation of narrator and character. That is, your first-person point-of-view character as two separate entities, one the storyteller and the other one as the actor, the doer, on the stage of the page. We'll continue this conversation with Emma Darwin next week when we go deep into psychic distance. Have a great writing week. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.